Oh, greetings, all my relatives. Welcome to another program, Eagle and Condor. This is Tony Gonzalez, your host today, Sunday, June 15, 2025. And please consider this a special Father's Day program. So I hope all the fathers are having a wonderful time with their families. And a special salute to veterans and the young people, particularly those, my relatives, who are out on the streets that we've been watching this last couple of weeks with the immigration and the ICE all coming together and causing quite a lot of confusion and consternation in the community, with people being arrested, families being separated. The country seems to forget that it's made of immigrants, and to turn the tide now with what's going on is we need to be looking at the midterm elections, my relatives, and all these executive orders and actions that are going on by the 47th president. It doesn't seem to be working quite well, particularly here in the state of California, where the president took the initiative to call in the federal forces, the Marines, to take care of a problem in Los Angeles, which indeed wasn't a problem according to the LA police, that they could have been handling it themselves. So overall, my relatives, there's an attack, an assault, call it what you want, but Indian people themselves, Native Americans here in this country, have been subjected to this type of attacks and assaults for 300, 400, 500 years, since 1492, if you will, my relatives. So we're tuned in, but it's the new citizenry of this country who is feeling the effects of these assaults. So you are the Indian now. Now you know how Indian people feel, and we are all together now, a common concern about the president of this country taking the society in a totally other direction. And as you saw, the 250-year anniversary of the Army, which was also the president's birthday, and troops and tanks through Washington, D.C., and now the damage on the streets. You got 60-ton tanks, creeping along. It's going to create damage. So there's a lot of cost, and particularly this type of waste of money when veterans are being denied medical services. Up to 20,000 veteran hospital workers have been taken out of work, and just a lot of problems like that, Mauritius. Overall, we have to really think about the youth and them having been on the streets, and importantly, access to public media, I think, is very important. So you're not listening to so much corporate-driven media, but listen to public access TV channels such as Eagle and Condor, or radio like KPFA in Berkeley, in San Francisco, KPOO, that's 89.5, and Berkeley KPFA at 94.1 FM. Tune into public access channels that can give you up-to-date on what is going on in the streets, because the tempo is picking up. We have to be alert, vigilant in taking care of our families and protecting our right to the democracy that we have been living under here in this country. So heads up on that, my relatives. Okay, the video we're going to see today is a continuation of the series that I had proposed, and as of the last 2 weeks, we've been bringing you the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the first and second session, and today you're going to see the third session of the Permanent Forum on Indian Issues, which was April 22nd, the morning session. That's the third session in the morning of April 22nd. And of course, the permanent forum goes on for 2 weeks, on through May the 2nd. So we're going to continue giving you a series of these videos so you can see for yourself how Indigenous peoples are engaging and working with governments at the United Nations to seek issues to many of the problems that Indian people are faced with. So there's an interactive dialogue on the rights of Indigenous women, a continuation from the panel discussion of the second session. So I hope you enjoy, and give me a call at 415-577-1492, or drop me an email at eltony1492@gmail.com if you have any comments, concerns, or issues that you would like to see broadcast on Eagle and Condor. All right, my relatives, let's go into that video, the Permanent Forum, the third session, interactive dialogue on the rights of Indigenous women.
The third meeting of the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is called to order. Distinguished members of the forum, distinguished observers and friends, in accordance with our program of work, the forum will now continue its consideration of Agenda Item 5E, Interregional, Intergenerational, and Global Dialogue on the Rights of Indigenous Women. I will first provide a brief recap of the key issues highlighted during the dialogue on the item at our second meeting yesterday afternoon. Thereafter, the forum will continue its interactive discussion to hear from other participants wishing to take the floor under this item. Yesterday afternoon, the Permanent Forum heard powerful and deeply important interventions from panelists who shared how Indigenous women have brought visibility to their unique concerns while upholding the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. These reflections reaffirm that Indigenous women are vital, not only to the survival and continuity of their communities, but also to broader society as transmitters of knowledge, culture, and tradition. As we mark 30 years since the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and 25 years since the 23rd special session of the General Assembly on Gender Equality, it is important to recognize that Indigenous women have led sustained advocacy to advance their rights. While progress has been made, the persistent denial of their human rights continues to result in a disadvantage across multiple areas of life. Today, as women's rights and rights of Indigenous peoples are increasingly under threat, Indigenous women and girls continue to face layered and systemic challenges. Despite this, they remain strong advocates, calling on member states to fulfill international commitments and to integrate gender equality, specifically addressing Indigenous women across all development policies and programs. The Permanent Forum continues to serve as a vital platform for amplifying the voices of Indigenous women. Their rights remain a key priority, mainstreamed across the forum's work and reflected in its recommendations. In response to continued calls from Indigenous women around the world, the forum has adopted numerous recommendations that call for action and accountability from member states, the UN system, and civil society, particularly regarding human rights, culture, health, the environment, political participation, development, and ending violence against Indigenous women and girls. Now, more than ever, action is needed to turn words into results and ensure justice and equality. To support this ongoing work, the Secretariat of the Forum has prepared a conference room paper entitled "The Status of Indigenous Women and Their Role in the 30-Year Review of the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which covers progress from 2020 to 2025. This paper is a modest example of efforts underway, but it also reminds us how much more remains to be done to fully achieve the rights of Indigenous women. The forum will now continue its interactive discussion under this item. Before I open the floor, I would like to note once more that there is no pre-established list of speakers for this dialogue. In keeping with the forum's established practice for dialogues, member states and UN entities should press their microphone button to request the floor. The representative of Indigenous peoples' organizations will be called by the name of their organization. Once called, please press the button and raise your hand to enable the sound engineers to identify you and activate their microphone. And I just want to emphasize, once called, press the button. We will maintain the rotation of statements applied in our discussion of this item yesterday, by which a statement by a member state will be followed by an intergovernmental organization or UN agency, followed by an Indigenous peoples organization. All speakers should kindly be mindful of the time limit of 3 minutes for statements and are requested to speak at a reasonable speed to facilitate accurate interpretation. Observers delivering statements are requested to send a copy of their e-statement to e-statements@un.org before their intervention. Please ensure the name of the meeting, the speaker's name, and the agenda item are clearly indicated in both the subject line of the email and the heading of the statement. This will help ensure accurate interpretation and proper documentation. I will move on to the representative of Foro Internacional de Mujeres Indígenas.
Muy buenos dias. A very good morning. Greetings to you, Madam Chair, and all brothers and sisters here present. The International Forum of Indigenous Women expresses its gratitude to you for dedicating this session, this specific session, not to the issue of Indigenous women, because we're not the topic, but rather to the individual and selective rights of Indigenous women. 30 years have elapsed since the adoption of the Beijing Platform of Action. At this juncture, I wish to underscore the work done by the various regional networks of Indigenous women across Africa, Asia, the Pacific, the Americas, and the Arctic. Particularly, I recognize them for their perseverance, their commitment, their work for the rights of Indigenous women. Yesterday, we also heard several statements regarding General Recommendation 39 on the rights of Indigenous women and girls. We participated in that negotiation process over several years. Fortunately, that General Recommendation was adopted by CEDAW. FEMI is preparing, that is my network, is preparing an implementation plan for General Recommendation 39. Consequently, we greatly value the commitment that we heard expressed yesterday, both from a number of agencies, governments, and Indigenous peoples' organizations. We also wish to go back to what was said by the Secretary General yesterday. He said that we have to continue working to guarantee the full participation of Indigenous women. In recent years, we have heard statements made, statements of commitments, that is. However, these commitments need to be turned into tangible action. They need to become practice. Words need to turn into budgets, plans, and programs at a local, national, and regional level. International mechanisms such as the CSW, in its revitalization process, the process seeking to rejuvenate its operations should lend visibility to the rights, views and opinions of Indigenous women. Consequently, we ask the Permanent Forum to continue making such recommendations so that these aforementioned mechanisms fully include Indigenous women in their deliberations as well as their proposals. They need to adopt an intersectional approach to Indigenous women and see their rights as indivisible. Thank you.
I thank the representative for Foro Internacional de Mujeres Indígenas. I now call upon the representative from the International Indian Treaty Council.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We note with appreciation the instrumental role the Permanent Forum as the first UN body to recognize environmental violence in its 2012 session report. This recognition was a direct result of the declaration presented from the Second International Indigenous Women's Symposium, which called on the international community to identify the disproportionate impacts of environmental toxins on Indigenous women and children as environmental violence, for which states and corporations can be held accountable. Previous symposium recommendations included calls on states and the UN system to address ongoing impacts on maternal and intergenerational health by industrial pollutants, toxic chemicals, heavy metals, and other contaminants. A notable and a historic example of the progress made are the two references to environmental violence in CEDAW's General Recommendation 39, including its conclusion that states should act promptly to support the work of Indigenous women and girls who are environmental human rights defenders and ensure their protection and security. We are very pleased to report that Indigenous women from 20 countries and territories from around the globe gathered at the 4th International Indigenous Women's Symposium on Environmental Violence in Guatemala in January of this year, hosted by the IATC, FEMI, CONAVIGUA, and CADP. It addressed ongoing impacts of extractive industries, including sexual violence and trafficking, mercury and pesticides, as well as the impacts of imposed protected areas, market-based false solutions to climate change, and ongoing violations of Articles 22, 24, and 29 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We kindly request that the Permanent Forum recognize the 4th Declaration on Environmental Violence, which is posted as an information note, it's in entirety, in Spanish and English, on the webpage for this session. This will support the ongoing advocacy for policy change by Indigenous women in all UN bodies that impact these critical issues, highlighting the current processes of amending the Pesticide Code of Conduct with FAO and WHO, as well as the current negotiations towards a new UN treaty on plastics pollution. We appreciate the Permanent Forum's continued support in this regard. Chi-miigwech, many thanks.
I thank the representative from the International Indian Treaty Council. I now call upon the representative from the National Rural Women's Coalition Limited, Australia.
Ngai, and thank you, Madam Chair. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the Onondaga and Lenape's peoples. I extend this to all others here today and my own peoples. My name is Chantal Thompson, and I'm a Mulliangappa Nungu of the Barkindji and Yimpa Nations. I am descendant from the oldest living culture in the world. I come here today as a sovereign, self-determined and dreaming-led woman, walking with the strength of my ancestors and the fire of the future in my bones, planting seeds for generations. Known as the Barkindji Warrior, a name gifted to me by Aunty Sharon Kirby, I weave together being a daughter, sister, mother, auntie, black belt and world champion, storyteller, entrepreneur and founder of being a knowledge keeper, guide and warrior. But this is not the story or experience that colonial and patriarchal Australia would have me share as an Indigenous woman. It would have me birth my story from trauma and adversity, that of a victim, as a statistic that can be debated and a tool of political agendas. It is a narrative defined by deficit, of being an other, of being less than. We are seen as problems to be managed, not sovereign and matriarchal leaders. Too often to receive support, we are expected to prostitute our trauma. We must perform our pain, but not be too strong or healed, or the funding disappears. We fund crisis and case management, not potential and purpose. This is the violence of the current system, a model that rewards suffering and punishes resilience. It is ineffective, it is dangerous, and it must change. My story was seeded in the womb of my ancestors. This is a narrative we as Indigenous women live and give to the world, one of warrior heart, Indigenous culture, matriarchal power and feminine rising. I stand here today not as one, but as thousands of generations who came before me and who will come after me. Here we stand, our ancestors' greatest dreaming, our generation's greatest strength, and the next generation's legacy. I speak today from the journey of remembrance, reclamation and rising as a sovereign and self-determined Indigenous woman and mother. We as Indigenous women are raising children, healing communities, revitalising cultures, all while navigating the colonial load and cultural responsibilities. But let me be clear, we are not broken, we are not helpless, we are powerful beyond measure. Our rising is not just personal, it is political, it is cultural. To member states, I call on you. We need unified, untied, multi-year funding that enables Indigenous women and communities to build sustainable foundations for our own futures. Funding that supports not just projects, but the infrastructure and foundations of equity, justice, sovereignty and self-determination. We urge the full adoption and implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples under it, including all articles. These rights must be embedded in all legislative, social and policy frameworks, not just as tokens, but as the full reflection of the rights of Indigenous peoples. I'm not here to ask for permission. I'm here to remind the world. When Indigenous women rise, the world changes. Let us lead not as a gesture, but as a global necessity. Thank you.
I thank the representative from the National Rural Women's Coalition Limited, Australia. I now call upon the representative for Khmer's Capuche Krom Federation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm deeply honored to be in this space dedicated to honoring and recognizing the strength, resilience, and contributions of Indigenous women. The voices of Indigenous women have long since nurtured and empowered the lives of their communities. Women in our culture are holders of traditional knowledge in our homeland of Capuche Krom in the Mekong Delta. For the Khmer Krom people, we hold the history of women critical to our identity, so we dedicate our celebrations to the resilience and culture during International Women's Month. However, in being able to express our pride, our Khmer Krom women are met with hostility and persecution. When our women and men honor our traditional roles of women, information on women's rights of our people face restrictions and reprisals. Under the constant threat of surveillance and under the pressure of governmental harassment, the Khmer Krom peoples cannot wholeheartedly take part in the community engagement that empowers the Indigenous identity. Ms. Din Thi Huyen, a human rights defender, used her voice during International Women's Day to advocate and teach other Indigenous women about their inherent rights. Horrifically, she was tracked down and harassed, and currently she is sentenced to 2 years in prison. There has been no crime committed, which means that her voice as an Indigenous woman has been penalized and labeled as criminal. The repression is not an isolated incident. It reflects a broader pattern of systemic marginalization rooted in the intersection of gender, ethnicity, and state control. Khmer Krom women are the cultural bedrock in our communities, preserving language, passing on ancestral knowledge, and nurturing the identity. Yet they are received by the government as less than. We respectfully offer the following recommendations. We call on member states, including Vietnam, to immediately end the criminalization of Indigenous women defenders and ensure the right to peaceful assembly and cultural expression, including during International Women's Day. Being an Indigenous woman is not a crime. It must be cherished on the 30th anniversary of Beijing World Conference. 2, we urge Vietnam to release Khmer Krom women activists, including those imprisoned for organizing peaceful events, such as International Women's Day. And 3, we urge the UN and donors to allocate dedicated funding to support Khmer Krom and other Indigenous women-led organizations that work on cultural survival, land, language rights, and climate resilience. Thank you.
I thank the representative from Khmer's Capuche Krom Federation. I now call upon the representative from the Federación de Organizaciones Indígenas del Napo, Fuin.
Buenos días.
Good morning. My name is Miss Lishua. I'm an Amazonian Quechua woman. I am here representing 34 Indigenous women from across Latin America who have signed the charter submitted by this forum, or the letter submitted to this forum. We asked in that letter that we be recognized formally and that it be recognized formally that criminal activities are an existential threat to our peoples. We recommended to the forum that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights be called upon to draw up a specialized report regarding the impact of organized crime on the impact of illegal economies on Indigenous peoples. This report must contain specific recommendations to guarantee that we are protected, ensuring that member states incorporate into their security policies the need to protect us. As regards Indigenous governance, human security, access to intercultural health, and the protection of our livelihoods, all of these must be protected. We cannot talk about implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples if we do not recognize that illegal mining, drug trafficking, illegal logging, human trafficking, and other illicit activities are killing us. These criminal economies pollute our rivers with mercury. They destroy our food sources. They worsen our health and undermine our economies. And they sow fear among our community. Leaders are killed. Our young people are recruited. And we are dispossessed of our lands and turfed out. I'm wondering, why are we still not taking decisive action within these fora? These fora should provide a response. Our peoples cannot wait any longer. We need sufficient water, and now we seem to have sufficient water. Well, we're given toxic plastic to collect it in, so that's another problem. Thank you.
I thank the representative from the Federación de Organizaciones Indígenas del Napo. I now ask the representative for COICA.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A very good morning, sisters and brothers. I'm talking to you from the heart of the Amazon as the General COICA coordinator. That is the biggest organization of Indigenous peoples in the world. I'm also talking to you as the first woman to chair that organization after 40 years of existence. I'm not here by mere coincidence. I'm here as a result of the strength of our grandchildren, our young people, and our martyrs. Indigenous women from the Amazon basin endure systematic structural violence as well as systemic violence. We are age-old owners of the biological beating heart of the planet, but when we don't even have our rights to speak on its behalf recognized, we can no longer remain silent. As such, I harness the strength and pain of our sisters, to speak out on behalf of our territories. Our territories' voices ring out here. I wish to directly appeal to the Permanent Forum, to states, and to all actors within the international system. I appeal to them all to, one, recognize in their reports and recommendations that violence against Indigenous women is not episodic in nature. It is structural, intersectional, and multifaceted. This fact must become visible and must become a cross-cutting priority of Agenda 2030. Two, organizations must assign specific resources sustained over time to ensure the full, effective, and autonomous participation of Indigenous women in all decision-making spaces. We don't want symbolic, tokenistic invitations. We demand that we participate with a voice and a vote. This must be a binding obligation. States must conduct independent inquiries and issue model sanctions to businesses for crimes against humanity perpetrated as a result of extractivism. Women are most affected by those crimes. Oil, mining, and mining activities leave toxic metals such as arsenic, mercury, and lead, and all of these metals contaminate our rivers and affect the reproductive health of our women. There are cases of infertility, fetal abnormalities, miscarriages, cancers, and rare illnesses, and that was seen with the Mechero people in Ecuador. and other people were similarly affected. States must have differentiated public policies to work with Indigenous people in a differentiated way so that they can continue to retain their cultural identity. Silence is no more. We don't come here to ask for your permission. We come to demand justice for our physical and cultural survival and our dignity. Because when an Indigenous woman speaks, she doesn't speak alone. The microphone is being cut off.
Thank you to Representative of Koika. And now I give the floor to New Zealand Nurses Organization. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Kerry Nuku, a proud woman of Ngāti Kahungunu and Ngātai descent. Traditionally, Māori women exercised power and authority and influenced developing social, economic and cultural lives of Māori communities. Their political leadership, defenders of the whenua, the environment and the land. Traditional knowledge holders of the past, defenders of the future, shaping our genealogy and birthing the next generation. Through the continuous violence of coloniality, women have defended the restoration of our traditions, politicised and organised protests to defend the loss of land, rights and Māori. In 1975, Whena Cooper led one of the most important hikoi of the time, galvanising our people to defend against the ongoing loss of land. Last year, a proposed law to remove legal references to the principles of our founding document, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, removing the principles of self-determination, guardianship of our natural resources and equity, saw the largest political rally in our nation's history. Māori women guiding the march across the country, while our Māori women politicians defended our honour in Parliament. People marched under the kaupapa of self-determination and unity standing shoulder to shoulder as Māori, and joined by others of all ethnicity and religions, refusing to accept the racist and Māori policies of the current government. However, the unfettered political power poses further law changes through the Regulatory Standards Bill, which attacks Indigenous rights, environmental protection, and will also remove the obligation for the Crown to consider Te Tiriti o Waitangi when drafting law and setting regulations. Further entrenching inequities for Māori women, systemic biases in education, employment, and social and health justice. Notwithstanding, this government is already creating another stolen generation by taking out the clause in child welfare law, which means Māori child and state care will be given to non-Māori people to raise, creating more disconnection of the children from our culture. In conclusion, our genealogy is timeless, and so will our fight be. To echo the speakers from the opening, what we need is power and unity, humility, political will, and leadership of traditional people. We call on the UN to build inter-regional power, to establish the international support and binding treaties, to build strong legal protections and codifications of Indigenous women's rights. Kia ora.
And thanks to the representative of New Zealand Nurses Organization. Now I have to give the floor of our chair, Haluki Kotir. Please, Chair. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. I would like to read out a statement on behalf of our colleague, Forum Member Hania Mogani, on Agenda Item 5E. Thank you, Chair. I would like to begin by drawing attention to an absence that speaks volumes. An Indigenous woman leader from West Asia, nominated by her peers as the regional representative to this forum, is not here today. Not because she did not want to be, not because her people did not need her here, but because her visa has not been issued. Once again, an Indigenous voice, an Indigenous woman's voice, was silenced by the weight of bureaucratic exclusion, racialized security regimes, and the persistent structural barriers faced by those of us from the margins. This is not an isolated case. This is a reflection of a much deeper crisis. We are gathered here to speak of full and effective participation, but participation is not effective when it is selective. It is not full when Indigenous women, especially from the Global South, are disproportionately excluded, unheard, and unseen. It is not participation if access is subject to state discretion, political climate, or passport privilege. Indigenous women carry ancestral knowledge, hold communities together through conflict, and defend territories and life at the front line. Yet, when it comes to international policy spaces, we are too often the ones left behind, not for lack of expertise, but because the doors were never fully opened to begin with. UNDRIP affirms in Articles 18 and 41 the right of Indigenous peoples to participate in decision-making in matters that affect them. This is not an aspiration, it is a right. And yet, that right continues to be denied. Let us be clear, the legitimacy of this forum does not come from its physical setting or institutional name. Its legitimacy comes from the Indigenous peoples who shape it, sustain it, and speak through it. When those very peoples, particularly Indigenous women, are excluded from the most basic right to be present, the forum itself stands at a crossroads. Let us ask ourselves, how many Indigenous women were never given a seat at this table, not because they didn't try, but because the system is not caring of them effectively? And how many more will be lost in the silence if we do not act now? Therefore, we offer this clear and urgent recommendation. This forum must respond decisively and without delay whenever such fundamental rights are violated. When the host country repeatedly fails to uphold the right of Indigenous peoples to participate fully and effectively, it is no longer enough to issue statements. We must move beyond words and take principled action. We call for the immediate relocation of the permanent forum to a country that ensures, respects, and facilitates the full and effective participation of all Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous women, from all regions without discrimination or delay. This is not a logistical matter. It is a matter of justice. Until all Indigenous women can enter this room freely, speak without fear, and be heard without obstruction, the vision of full and effective participation remains unfulfilled. Thank you. I want to reiterate that this statement that I've just read is a statement from our sister forum member, Hania Mogani. Thank you, Chair.
I thank you, Madam Chair. I now give the floor to distinguished forum member, Darío Mejía Montalvo. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This morning, we heard a number of statements that contained kind invitations extended to forum members and expressions of gratitude for our work. I thank those who addressed those words and invitations in connection with our work to us. I wish to assure you that we take our work very seriously, more specifically the task of facilitating respectful dialogue. We take very seriously our responsibility to ensure that all voices are heard, however difficult matters under discussion may be. However difficult discussions are, we need to listen to each other. That's vital. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite attendees or parties that feel that they may have been alluded to in a number of statements by their co-national brothers and sisters, I invite you to take measures to fulfill your historic commitments. Measures which will allow you to allay concerns expressed and allay concerns that lead certain delegations to come to these fora to express their concerns. I'm greatly thankful for commitments made to strengthen our work under the banner of independence. The forum must remain independent. Regarding what's been said about working methods, we've taken due note of those comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. To you, distinguished member of the Permanent Forum, Mr. Montalvo.
Sorry. We have another. Yes. Member intervention. Please, Hindu, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And good morning, everyone. First of all, congratulations to you in the presidency of the Permanent Forum. And we have seen an actual demonstration of the leadership of Indigenous women here because a woman chairs the forum. The subject matter before us today is very important to us as members of the Permanent Forum. That is why we decided that the first session would have a dialogue on the rights of Indigenous women. The rights of Indigenous women must be recognized and respected by all member states, including those represented in the room, who must do their utmost to extend assistance to Indigenous women who are here and who are not here, respecting their right to speak at all levels, including international, regional, and local levels, so that we could truly implement the provisions of the declaration we adopted here. Over 30 years, what have we done to promote the rights of women in general and the rights of Indigenous women in particular? How can we better integrate their rights with human rights in general, give them a voice so that they can participate in the negotiations and the discussions and the decisions to be made on women's rights? I also wanted to respond to my sister who spoke about using women as weapons of war, and that happens everywhere in the world. We insist that women must be respected in war as in peacetime. They give life and protect life. They play an essential role in caring for children, boys and girls. And respect for women, the life-giving members of our society, is essential. In Sudan, we have a number of refugees, but also everywhere in the world there are large refugee communities. And to respect the rights of women who find themselves in the midst of armed conflict is absolutely essential to make sure they continue living and giving life. To conclude, I'd like to say women are not just victims, they're heroes. Our mothers, our grandmothers who brought us up, who gave us life, who introduced us to the world, they're heroes and must be celebrated as such. We must continue elevating women and looking to them as models for the construction of a better world. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank our distinguished colleague, Indu Umehu Ibrahim, member of the forum, for her comments.
Members, distinguished observers, we have now concluded our consideration of this item. We will now take a 5 minutes break to rearrange the podium for the next item, item 3.
Thank you for your patience. Distinguished members of the forum, distinguished observers, in accordance with our program of work, the forum will begin its consideration of item 3, discussion on the theme implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within United Nations member states and the United Nations system, including identifying good practices and addressing challenges. We will first hear from our distinguished panelists here on the podium, to whom I extend a very warm welcome. I now give the floor to Ms. Alison Kaliher.
Anamasi Nisne, Kuyana. I thank you very much for this opportunity to humbly speak before you about evaluating institutional structures through the Indigenous Determinants of Health Measurement Instrument. You'll see in the next slide our overview and background. This study aims to implement and evaluate specific measurement tools and provide guidance and track efforts that center Indigenous rights, cultural safety, and the Indigenous determinants of health. It expands on 2 previous Indigenous determinants of health studies, which provided a conceptual base and summary of structural factors impacting Indigenous health. The Indigenous Determinants of Health study was developed in 2023 by 35 scholars in all 7 socioeconomic regions as a response to the apathy, lack of education, and systemic shortcomings that UN agencies have shown in terms of cultural safety and compliance with Indigenous rights as per the provisions included in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These studies identify indigeneity as an overarching determinant of health and encompass 17 protective and 16 risk factors that influence Indigenous health outcomes. These unique factors are organized under 3 themes: intergenerational holistic healing, the health of Mother Earth, and re-indigenizing and decolonizing culture, which are also included in the evaluation study that I'm presenting today. Next slide. This evaluation study presents a transformative tool designed to evaluate and improve institutional responsiveness to Indigenous peoples' health and well-being, including how well national and international entities align with the principles of cultural safety, aspects of equity, and Indigenous rights as laid out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Mainstream evaluation frameworks and narratives often fail to account for the holistic concept of health as understood by the Indigenous worldview. The evaluation tool is structured as a 20-item scorecard grouped into 4 thematic sections. The intergenerational holistic healing, the health of Mother Earth, decolonizing and re-indigenizing culture and systems, and finally, institutional compliance with Indigenous rights. Each item is rated on a scale of 0 to 3, with total scores offering a benchmark of institutional performance. The range of performance is excellent, good, needs improvement, or poor. Next slide. As the first example of an evaluation item, promotion of Indigenous traditional ancestral medicine, our indicator is support for Indigenous communities to implement these types of practices in our communities. The metrics for measurement include agency guidelines to protect, respect, and foster not only practice, but also the expansion of traditional medicinal methods in Indigenous communities. Also, grants and resources that allow this effect are included, and the scores include high, medium, low, or very low, depending on whether existing policies, some support, minimal awareness, or no resources are allocated. Next slide, please. The next evaluation item is incorporation of land, ecological, and environmental components into Indigenous peoples' projects. And this indicator includes initiatives and resources that safeguard stewardship and management of natural elements, while incorporating ecology, water, land, and air components into culturally safe activities. Our metrics involve fostering the protection of and respect for Indigenous communities to own, manage, and govern over their own ancestral lands and resources in a sovereign fashion. I'd like to emphasize sovereignty in this case. Availability of resources help us stay connected to our environment and our community and help us to care for the planet. The scoring is similar: high, medium, low, or very low, depending on whether efforts are well-resourced, partially or potentially resourced, or whether there are no discussions. Next slide. Finally, the implementation and path forward includes forming an advisory group with Indigenous leaders, orienting and training to understand cultural and technical aspects, adaptation to local contexts through community consultation, further, pilot testing for feasibility, which is really what we need to partner with you, other Indigenous peoples and organizations in order to do, and full implementation using participatory and community-led assessments, as well as collaborative data analysis and developing action plans for ongoing monitoring on these scorecards. The path forward includes that the scorecard is a living tool and it requires our involvement to refine this scorecard with Indigenous people's feedback and involvement. Future improvements will expand and scale the use of this scorecard, and it aims to support systemic change and health justice for Indigenous people. Anamasi Kuyana. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank Ms. Kalir. I now ask, and we will now hear from Mr. Jose Francisco Kalir.
Muchísimas gracias, señora.
Many thanks indeed, Madam Chair, distinguished colleagues on this panel. Today, to participate as a panelist at the 24th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is something that I do with the greatest sense of humility, a deep sense of thanks, and a great sense of honour. I wish to begin by recalling the history and challenges that we've overcome, such as to allow the very establishment of this forum in the year 2000. That was a hard-won gain. We struggled for it. I wish to remember the many brothers and sisters that have returned to their ancestors. I extend particular thoughts to my brother from the Mapucho region of Chile. He returned to the land of the spirits 3 weeks ago. As peoples that existed before the formation of modern states, we practice what we preach at this forum, and we have done since the very beginning of our cultures. In the Mayan culture, the Popotna, for example, was a forum in which we discussed problems, solutions, and the common needs of people. So we've preempted this forum. There are many other such examples across the world and among other indigenous peoples. This forum is the result of the union and organization of all of those people that belong to indigenous peoples of the world. We're all aware of the importance of speaking out and raising our hands to defend not only our rights, but also our very essence, Mother Nature, things that are all now called the natural resources of our territories. And we need to speak out loud and clear about our people's demands. The importance of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and having it here at the United Nations in New York lies in the fact that we're lending visibility to our peoples and our rightful struggles. We're doing that in this house where peoples of the world discuss their problems. and the importance of fighting. We're continuing our struggle, and that is important, but being here is part of our efforts to occupy decision-making places, such as those that I myself have personally occupied. I now have the opportunity to contribute to this panel talking about the challenges the state has in terms of fulfilling its commitment to the indigenous peoples of Guatemala, and I advise our government. We have made progress, but today more than ever before we need to build on our legacy and protect it. Continuity cannot mean monotony or resting on our laurels. We're at a crucial juncture for humankind. It seems that peace is succumbing and the world's stability is increasingly under threat as a result of armed conflicts which stymie dialogue and hamper progress in terms of recognizing indigenous peoples' rights in today's world. In light of the above, I'd say that to talk about good practices, I'll begin with something I've already previously said. The Declaration is nothing new, but its content compels us to reaffirm the fact that we have made progress in terms of being acknowledged by indigenous peoples. The Declaration reaffirms the fact that we pre-existed states, and it says that we have a legal personality, legal rights, and rights to self-determination. We have differentiated, collective, and individual rights. We particularly have rights to land and resources. Another good practice has been the ability to make aforementioned commitments into reality through a robust international legal framework, which means that now indigenous people's rights must be upheld. The ILO Convention 169 was adopted by the ILO's International Conference in 1989, and that was a step forward. There was also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, to use its English acronym, was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007. There's also the American Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, adopted by the General Assembly of the OAS in 2006. And we have the Inter-American System of Human Rights that also includes the American Convention on Human Rights. And that was achieved through the work of the Commission and the Inter-American Courts of Human Rights. The latter uses its evolving body of jurisprudence to focus on one particular article of the Inter-American Convention and uses that to include collective ownership of land and its resources as a right that indigenous people must enjoy. Other more recent milestones in the struggle of indigenous peoples on the international stage include these mechanisms and conventions, including those exclusively dedicated to protecting and preserving the rights of indigenous people. In 2000, we had the creation of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues by ECOSOC. 2001 saw the creation of a special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. 2007 saw the adoption of UNDRIP by the UN General Assembly, and that restored the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people by the Human Rights Council, a UN body. There were various human rights treaty bodies of the United Nations which issued various observations, including Observation 11 under the Committee on the Rights of the Child. There was the 1997 General Comment 23 under the Commission on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Of course, there are still challenges, but I give you this list of achievements harking back to the sadness and the grief that led people to struggle forward to protect the environment. We're in a world blinded by unbridled consumerism and egotism, and that means that we don't protect indigenous people. That's paradoxical because now indigenous people suffer the most from challenges they did nothing to create. The environment, climate change, and the resilience of indigenous women. There's also the struggles of indigenous peoples. They still continue to face discrimination. Indigenous people need to access justice. Free, prior and informed consent of indigenous peoples is also a challenge. Lands, territories and resources must be returned. Right to self-determination of indigenous peoples must be assured. These are some of the rights most frequently violated. These need to be restored, and enjoyed, and member states of this organisation must ensure that happens. Thank you, Chair.
I thank Mr. Khalid Saif for his statement. I will now give the floor to Ms. Roby Hallett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to share the experience of the work of the Indigenous Navigator Consortium. 300. While waiting for the slide to come up, which gives a snapshot of what we do in the Indigenous Navigator, the Indigenous Navigator is one of the many initiatives led and undertaken by Indigenous peoples to systematically monitor the level of recognition and implementation of our rights as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, core human rights conventions as they pertain to Indigenous peoples, and other relevant processes. Now on its third phase, with continued support from the European Union, the Indigenous Navigator is implemented in 29 countries across Asia, Arctic, Africa, and Latin America. In the Indigenous Navigator, the process leading to the collection, analysis, and production of data is done by Indigenous peoples themselves. It provides spaces for Indigenous women, youth, and other marginalized groups within the community to be able to articulate their concerns, needs, and priorities. The conduct of community data gathering and analysis initiatives have become spaces for intergenerational learning and community strengthening, as majority of those involved in data gathering are Indigenous youth, and community discussions and reflections have become an eye-opener also for them on the history and struggles of their community. Data generated from the community surveys of the Indigenous Navigator indicate that there is still generally a lack of recognition of the collective rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources, and along with this is the non-implementation of free, prior, and informed consent on matters affecting Indigenous peoples. In the national survey, 62% have responded that their state's constitution does not recognize Indigenous people's right to freely determine their political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Back to the community surveys, 82% responded that they are experiencing conflicts related to land or resources that's caused by illegal logging or other illegal activities, disputes within and among communities, settlers, extractive industries, and large-scale plantation, among others. Access to justice and remedies still wanting for many Indigenous communities, with 66% responding that those who committed violations in their territories have not been held to account under national justice system. On education, data coming out reveal that mother tongue-based education is still lacking for many Indigenous learners, and only a number of Indigenous youth are able to go for tertiary and higher studies. This is just a glimpse of how far we still are in the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Through the Indigenous Navigator, initiatives are ongoing to engage with relevant government agencies and statistics office to strengthen data disaggregation by ethnicity of states and ensure that development plans are aligned to the self-determined needs and priorities of Indigenous peoples. Beyond data gathering, the Indigenous Navigator supports Indigenous peoples to implement their self-determined priorities. The projects implemented range from mother tongue-based education, orthography, digital literacy, water and sanitation, construction of health clinics and maternity wards, and support for traditional livelihoods such as beekeeping, among others. These reflect that there's a general lack of access of Indigenous peoples to the very basic social services and needs for their health and well-being. As I mentioned earlier, the Indigenous Navigator is just one of the Indigenous peoples-led initiatives to advance not only data governance and data sovereignty, but also development aligned to our self-determined development. I was privileged to have been part of the Global Indigenous Data Sovereignty Conference held in Canberra last month, where Indigenous peoples presented their initiatives on Indigenous-led medical researches on artificial intelligence, initiatives strengthening data governance and infrastructure at the community level, and initiatives to take back and correct data extracted from Indigenous peoples. There is a growing movement of Indigenous peoples advancing data governance and sovereignty. But the big challenge is still the non-recognition of Indigenous peoples and our collective rights as enshrined in the UN REAP. There is also the non-recognition of data that we generated and the lack of trust on that data. The collaborative on citizen-generated data is a step in the right direction, but we need the political will of states at the national level to really implement the UN Declaration and put in place mechanisms where Indigenous peoples can effectively generate and contribute their own data and be part of decision-making. We refuse to remain invisible and unseen. We persist to generate and take back our data, our stories, for our people and future generations. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Halib for her statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Katie Kiss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a privilege to sit here with you on this panel today in my capacity as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner and on behalf of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Australia's national human rights institution. I acknowledge the Lenape and Anadaka peoples who are the traditional custodians of Manhattan Island and pay my respects to their elders past, present and rising. I also acknowledge all Indigenous peoples and government representatives here with us today and the achievements made to date. I take this opportunity, Madam Chair, to congratulate you as the appointed Chair and Vice Chairpersons appointed to this forum. In answering the question as to how Member States have implemented the Declaration successfully into national policies, I think it's important that we look at 4 key elements. Firstly, design, the extent to which states have incorporated the Declaration into the drafting of legislation and policy frameworks. Practice, the degree to which state actions on the ground are aligned with the Declaration. Evaluation, the standard to which states are reporting progress towards fulfilment of the Declaration. And accountability, the presence of mechanisms which oblige states to acknowledge failures and at any of these levels and put in place measures to improve performance. All 4 are essential to genuine progress. While there is no single way to implement the Declaration, the Australian Human Rights Commission promotes a principled approach which can be categorised into 4 sets of principles: self-determination, participation in decision-making underpinned by free, prior and informed consent and good faith, respect for and protection of culture, and equality and non-discrimination. These 4 principles provide guidance on how First Nations communities, government, civil society and the private sector can apply the Declaration to fully realise the human rights of Indigenous peoples. With respect to challenges, for many Indigenous peoples, progress has been slow, uncoordinated and indirect. Many states have yet to put all the pillars in place required to achieve effective implementation. I referenced the introductory remarks provided by the Secretary-General yesterday that the rights of Indigenous peoples are not negotiable. One of the greatest challenges to implementing the Declaration is that at country levels, the rights of Indigenous peoples are negotiable, they are dispensable, and they are subject to populist politics. Indigenous peoples are required to sit with governments to negotiate what rights are palatable and what rights are not. This is subject to the priorities of those governments, rather than the priorities, needs and the full suite of affirmed rights of Indigenous peoples within the Declaration. The absence of national leadership or a national legal mechanism to hold governments accountable to their human rights obligations, including Indigenous peoples' rights, has resulted in governments willfully opposing and discarding their obligations and directly contradicting their commitments. This is reflected in policy and legislation that is discriminatory in practice and disproportionately impacts the lives of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have limited options for remedy or recourse other than to enter arduous international and domestic complaints processes or take legal action, both of which require substantial resources. In November last year, Australia's Joint Standing Committee on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs released its report on the application of the Declaration in Australia. We eagerly await a response to this inquiry report, which recommended the development of a national action plan in consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as well as legislative reforms that would require assessment against the Declaration in the design, development and delivery of draft laws presented to the Parliament. Importantly, states are not in a position to shift into a pattern of genuine progress without a sound and vocal accountability mechanism to identify what needs to change and where the work needs to be prioritised. This is why UN processes and independent national human rights institutions are so important. However, governments must be willing to engage and committed to achieving positive outcomes. There are also technical hurdles to implementation. While the 4 key sets of principles in the Declaration are understood conceptually within human rights theory, applying them practically at the local level has often been a challenge because governments often interpret these core principles purely in the context of international law through a state sovereignty lens as it relates to their relationships with other world governments, ignoring or denying First Nation status as sovereign peoples and as rights holders. And because Indigenous peoples have not often been resourced and engaged to describe and clarify what these core principles mean practically to their development and how governments should work with them to achieve them. One of the key barriers to success globally has been states' continuing struggle politically, conceptually and practically with notions of power sharing, co-design and co-delivery. All are essential for self-determination and effective implementation of the Declaration. The importance of Indigenous representative structures, well-resourced Indigenous organisations and the means to engage in international fora like this are key considerations for state engagement of Indigenous leaders and Indigenous peoples. In Australia, the withdrawal of funding for the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples and the failed national referendum to establish a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament have left Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with no national Indigenous representative structure through which to progress national priorities and reform. It is, however, encouraging to see active representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here at this forum, some of whom have received grant funding provided by the Australian Government. However, this investment in Indigenous leadership capability must be a sustained commitment as a minimum standard required by the Declaration. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Smith for her statements. We will now hear from Mr. Freddy Mamani Machaka.
Muchísimas gracias.
Many thanks indeed, Madam Chair. It is an honour to attend this UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues session. Amazonia is an ecosystem that is vital for the planet. It plays a crucial role in maintaining and preserving natural cycles as well as global environmental balance. As the largest tropical rainforest in the world, it is vital for the planet's hydrological system as well as for carbon capture and storage. It's also vital for the preservation of unique biodiversity which includes extraordinary phenomena such as so-called flying rivers. Today, on the 22nd of April, we mark the International Day of Mother Earth. The General Assembly of the United Nations is conducting its interactive dialogue, underscoring the need for wholesale change. We should move from an anthropocentric vision of our Mother Earth to one focused on life and respect for Mother Earth. In the Amazonian region, 50 million people are resident, including between 520 and 511 Indigenous peoples. Of this number, 346 have territories to which they have deeds that have been properly demarcated, accredited to them, or that they own in perpetuity. And they play a crucial role in conserving, managing and protecting their natural areas, their forests. Indigenous peoples are the true guardians of the Amazonian region. They have deeply rooted knowledge of ecosystems, knowledge which in many cases exceeds modern scientific knowledge. Evidence is resoundingly clear. Indigenous territories display significantly higher levels of conservation, higher, that is, than non-protected areas. That demonstrates the effectiveness of ancestral practices of the Indigenous peoples. The rights of Indigenous peoples are supported by crucial legal international instruments. These include the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples that was held in 2014. There is also ILO Convention 169 on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. All of these instruments reaffirm essential rights to land, territories, and to resources, rights to self-determination of the peoples, rights to free, prior and informed consent, and to full and effective participation in decision-making processes. The adoption of these instruments by many countries in the Amazon region has ultimately consolidated a legal framework, which means it is now an obligation to incorporate the vision, perspectives and priorities of Indigenous peoples into public policy. The Amazon Treaty Cooperation Organization, UDCA, as a socio-environmental bloc within Latin America, which comprises Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, Suriname and Venezuela, reaffirms its commitment to protecting the Amazon region and its indigenous peoples. In the Berlin Declaration, adopted on the 9th of August 2023, UDCA's member countries reaffirmed their commitment to the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This commitment has now manifested itself as tangible action. We've seen the creation of the Amazonian Mechanism for Indigenous Peoples. This is a pioneering instrument which will strengthen dialogue and cooperation between Indigenous peoples and member states. This Amazonian mechanism aforementioned was born as a response to an urgent appeal made by history, made by life itself, and made by those speaking out on behalf of the Amazon and of Mother Earth. This was indicated in paragraph 145 of the outcome document of the 23rd Permanent Forum session. It is vital to guarantee the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in environmental governance, including in processes leading to COP30, which will be held in Belém in Brazil next November. The Belém Declaration is, without a doubt, a milestone in environmental and social diplomacy. In that declaration, states recognize the leading role played by the Indigenous peoples in protecting the Amazon region, and they agreed to establish this mechanism together with a forum to ensure that the voices of Indigenous peoples are heard and that their knowledge comes to the fore. Challenges we face are immense. We're seeing the expansion of deforestation, drug trafficking, the erosion of biodiversity, pollution of water sources, and the effects of the climate crisis. All of these threaten the ecological stability of the region and the very physical and cultural survival of Indigenous peoples. Moreover, there are growing threats also facing Indigenous peoples who are in isolation and in initial stages of contact. Their protection must be an absolute priority for all member countries of the UDCA, but we're also seeing the emergence of unprecedented opportunities. This was indicated by the Secretary General when he opened this 24th session of the Permanent Forum. He said the Indigenous peoples are vital guardians of biodiversity and key allies in climate action. Their ancestral knowledge, their deeply rooted ties with territories, and their vision which prioritizes balance and reciprocity are crucial if we are to design effective and culturally relevant climate policies. Moreover, the Secretary General underscored that individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples are not negotiable. That means that it is even more necessary for us to have effective participation and governance mechanisms. Finally, as COP30 on climate change draws near, the Amazonian mechanism to which I previously referred is not only a tool for inclusion, but also a regional diplomatic strategy which positions the Amazon region as a place of environmental and ethical leadership. Here, member states of UDCA commit to facilitating the active participation of Indigenous peoples in climate negotiations. They commit to providing spaces for binational and regional synergies, and they commit to integrating their knowledge into adaptation and mitigation strategies. The implementation of UNDRIP in the Amazon region is not an option. It is a moral, legal, and environmental obligation. With political will, financial, technical, and human resources, and a rights-based approach, we can transform the Amazonian mechanism for the Indigenous peoples in a global model of multilateral and intercultural cooperation. Let this be a moment that we remember as one in which the Indigenous people ceased to be mere witnesses of history and became protagonists in the climate transformation of Amazonia. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Machaca for his statement. Distinguished delegates, we will now begin our general discussion on item 3, and we will hear from the speakers inscribed on the list of speakers for this item. I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia on behalf of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Group of Friends of Indigenous People, a cross group of steps committed to the promotion and protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples. The session of this year's Permanent Forum will focus on implementing UNDRIP. This is a timely and urgent call to translate the declaration into concrete action, both within member states and across the United Nations systems. Nearly 2 decades since its adoption, UNDRIP remains our international guiding framework for advancing the rights, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous people. At the heart of these efforts lies Article 3 of the Declaration, ensuring that Indigenous people can freely determine their political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development is fundamental to fulfilling our shared vision of equity, dignity, and human rights for all. Despite important progress, challenges persist. Indigenous peoples continue to face disproportionately high rates of marginalization and discriminations. Access to education, health, water, housing, and other economic and social programs to improve their well-being remains elusive, resulting in lower life expectancy, higher poverty rates, and higher child and infant mortality rates. Indigenous women and girls face particular risks and violence of their rights, often at the intersection of gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic marginalizations. Implementing the declaration, we must ensure the full protection, participation, and leadership in all spheres of the public life. Madam Chair, the engaging participation process launched in 2024 provides for Indigenous people full and effective participation in matters that will affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves within the United Nations. Indigenous people are relevant actors at the UN, and their voices must be heard. General Assembly Resolution 79/159.
I thank the representative for Colombia on behalf of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples. I now call upon the representative of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Thank you, Madam Chair, distinguished members of the Permanent Forum, distinguished delegates from member states, and respected representatives of Indigenous peoples. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Onondaga peoples as traditional owners of this land. Allow me to use this opportunity to update on key outcomes of the 16th meeting of the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD. At COP16 in Cali, parties adopt several key decisions. In addition to welcoming the recommendations from the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, COP16 adopted a milestone decision establishing a new permanent body under the Convention called the Subsidiary Body on Article NJ and other provisions related to Indigenous people and local communities. This new body will serve as an international forum where parties, Indigenous people, local communities, and other actors come together to develop tools, policies to fulfill the commitment in the Convention, especially those related to the implementation of Article 8J of the Convention on Traditional Knowledge. Replacing the former ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J, this subsidiary body will strengthen and elevate the role of traditional knowledge in the implementation of both the Convention and the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Parties also adopt a new program of work on Article 8J and other provisions, which align with the global framework. The program is guided by 9 general principles, 8 elements containing 29 tasks that are set to be implemented by 2030. Why this matters? Indigenous people are stewards of the much of the world's biodiversity. Their traditional knowledge and the way of life helps to protect nature. With the new subsidiary body and the program of work, their voices, their rights will be stronger and better reflected in biodiversity action. The first meeting of the subsidiary body will take place in October this year in Panama. At this meeting, parties will advance in the implementation of the new program of work and discuss the modus operandi of the subsidiary body, which will define the functioning, the modalities, and the governance structure. The draft, then, modus operandi will be submitted to COP16 for consideration and adoption. This is important to get it right, so parties and indigenous people can truly shape the future where we all live in harmony with nature in accordance to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. As I conclude, I would like to invite you to our side events, which will take place this 25th April, this Friday at 1:30 at CR9. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative for the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I now call upon the representative for Land Rights Defenders, Inc.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair. From the lands that have cradled our ancestors for millennia, from the rivers and their songs and the wind that brought their wisdom, we gather once more. We stand here not as petitioners, but as inheritors of ancient knowledge, as guardians of irreplaceable heritage, and as right holders whose voices must not only be heard, but heeded. I represent the resilient Huenyi Echama Tutua royal family, the indigenous people of Benimasi Bwedi and Goso, Ghana, and the land right defenders, born from our very struggle against exploitation by the Kumasi Traditional Council, who threaten our sacred heritage due to the insatiable desire for economic exploitation. Our fight for recognition has intensified recently, a testament to indigenous resilience. The word Benimasi, an Akan dialect meaning come and learn our roots. This phrase embodies our bond with Ashanti heritage. Crucially, these lands were a personal gift from Africa's illustrious king Osei Tutu to his wife, Queen Tutua, birthing a unique lineage through their daughter, Kunedu Efia Ofi. This personal grant, distinct from the communal two lands, form our allodial title, prophesied to be safeguarded by our grandfather, Nana Kwame Abosi, honoring King Osei Tutu's legacy. Yet our journey highlights Global South's overlooked plight. Despite our noble cause, we have received scant attention and support on global platforms. Evidence of these stark realities lies in our partnerships with Global Giving and Candid Guide Star, revealing a systemic imbalance in global attention. Despite this fueled by our own hard-earned resource and spirit, we've achieved a landmark victory, affirming our rightful ownership under Ghana's Land Act 2020. This victory, which confirms our inherent allodial title, acts as a living monument for those who fight to retain their narratives, often in the silence of global indifference. Our story is about advocacy, born from necessity, the resilience of the marginalized, and the urgent need for equitable global attention. We, the Huenyi Echama Tutua royal family and land right defenders, prove that even without the global North spotlight, our spirits shine as a fierce beacon for those who stand against historical silencing. We implore this forum to recognize the vital struggles often fought in the shadows of the Global South and stand with us, for in our victory lies a message of hope for all who are fighting for their right to exist and be heard. Thank you.
I thank the representative from the Land Rights Defenders, Inc. I now call upon the representative from Denmark on behalf of Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden.
Thank you, Chair. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark, together with Greenland. The Nordic countries reaffirm our full and firm commitment to the rights of indigenous peoples. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is of paramount importance. Together with other international human rights instruments, it provides a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, the dignity, and the well-being of all indigenous peoples. However, despite this, indigenous peoples are still facing discrimination and land dispossessions in many parts of the world. They are often suffering from shrinking democratic space, evictions, and severe negative consequences of climate change and ill-construed conservation efforts. Indigenous peoples are disproportionately overrepresented among the poor and extremely poor. It is important to remember that the internationally recognized rights of indigenous peoples did not, so to speak, fall from the sky. They required indeed a long and hard struggle. It is evident that we must persist, we must enhance, and we must accelerate our collective efforts to protect these rights, which are under constant threat. The Nordic countries believe that the right to participation is a key element of the right to self-determination, and hence highlights the need for all of us to progress. We need decisions and concrete actions to enhance indigenous peoples' full and effective participation in the UN system in all decisions that affect them. We will continue our efforts to advance this agenda in all relevant fora, including here in New York, on the enhanced participation agenda. In this regard, we welcome the work of indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions. Let me conclude by reiterating our full support for the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues. We commend the forum's valuable contribution to promoting the rights of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
I thank the representative from Denmark. I now call upon the representative from the International Fund for Agricultural Development.
Representative of Indigenous people, colleagues, it's a privilege to address this forum on behalf of IFAD. At IFAD, we recognize that Indigenous people are not just stakeholders, but right holders with distinct identities, governance systems, and contribution to global sustainability. We have worked in partnership with Indigenous communities since 1970s, and our policy on engagement with Indigenous people aligns with the principle of the UNDRIP, reinforcing their rights to self-determination, land, and culture. IFAD is committed to translating this principle into action. Three key areas illustrate our approach. First, institutionalize the Indigenous people participation at IFAD. The Indigenous People Forum at IFAD serves as a permanent dialogue mechanism and entry point for ensuring Indigenous people perspective shapes our policies and investment. Representative of the Indigenous People Forum at IFAD now participate and observes in IFAD high-level governing bodies meetings. Second, direct support to Indigenous people-led initiatives. The Indigenous People Assistance Facility provides direct funding to Indigenous organizations, reinforcing their autonomy in managing resources and implementing solutions for biodiversity conservation, climate resilience, and sustainable food systems. Its governance model, with a board composed mainly by Indigenous people leaders and regional level management by 3 Indigenous people organizations, ensure that funds are allocated based on Indigenous people priorities. Third, free, prior, and informed consent as a core principle. It's not just a safeguard, it's a tool for empowerment and co-creation. IFAD ensures that Indigenous people actively participate in shaping the projects that affect their communities. These include a pilot program to engage Indigenous experts in project design. Despite these efforts, barrier remains, particularly in resource mobilization, legal recognition, and full political inclusion of Indigenous people. IFAD reaffirms its commitment to working with Indigenous people as equal partners. We stand ready to support member states and UN entities in advancing the implementation of the UNDRIP, ensuring that Indigenous people rights are not only recognized but fully realized. I thank you.
I thank the representative from IFAD. I now call upon the representative from the Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Madam Chair, I speak on behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council with support from the Sami Council. We are facing uncertain times in the UN and globally, as many states dial back their support for the UN and human rights. Now is the time to stand firm on the fundamental human rights, asserting the status, rights, and role of Indigenous peoples. As peoples recognized as equal to all other peoples, we must maintain our perseverance in not letting our rights be devalued by conflations with so-called groups or local communities. And we must insist on states and the UN system in dialing up their accountability in that regard. Madam Chair, the UN system itself should be the guardian and strongest advocate for implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We recommend that the Permanent Forum call on all UN entities across the UN system to systematically ensure modalities for the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples. We have seen improvements on some platforms, yet we time and time again find ourselves fighting for the recognition of our already affirmed rights, be it at the UNEP Plastics Treaty, in climate and biodiversity negotiations, or elsewhere. Defunding of the UN and lack of willingness to ensure modalities and of access to funding for our participation put the hard-won rights of Indigenous peoples at risk. Madam Chair, implementing the UN Declaration is also an obligation for states in their actions towards other states. We recognize and are acutely aware of our region, the Arctic's significance for global geopolitics. We call on all states to uphold the promise, all Arctic states, to uphold the promise of abiding by international rules-based order. Times have changed since Inuit lands were mere commodities that could be bought and sold. In today's world, Inuit have asserted our rights and engaged in a range of self-determination arrangements, pursuing further self-determination. We are beyond the times of typical colonial attitudes of superiority. As global attention to our Arctic homelands and self-determination arrangements increase, Inuit refuse to be pitted against each other by state interests. I want to say this very clearly. There is simply no such thing as a better colonizer. We reject being treated as figures on a chessboard of power politics. On the contrary, we invite dignified and diplomatic dialogues for partnerships across state borders, and we insist on putting fundamental human rights and international rules-based order at the forefront.
I thank the representative of ICC. I now call upon the representative of Chile on behalf of the LGBTI core group.
Señora Presidenta. Madam Chair, I have the honor of issuing this statement on behalf of states that are members of the UN LGBTI core group. The primary goal of that core group is to work within the United Nations system to guarantee the universal respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms of all people without discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or real or perceived sexual characteristics, including lesbians, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex people. Our particular approach is one focused on LGBTI people and protecting them against discrimination. Madam Chair, allow me to touch on a number of the challenges which require greater efforts when we tackle discrimination against Indigenous peoples that are in the LGBTI community. Despite the fact that there is empiric evidence suggesting that Indigenous LGBTI people are disproportionately affected in terms of all forms of violence, including sexual and gender-based violence, stigma, and manifold forms of intersectional discrimination, this problem often tends to be absent from the reports and recommendations issued by this forum. Consequently, we recommend that you consider incorporating the situation of LGBTI Indigenous peoples into future reports and recommendations. Secondly, these meaningful participation remains limited within the United Nations for representatives of Indigenous people, including LGBTI Indigenous peoples, owing to many structural barriers. Consequently, the core group encourages member states to support measures which promote the full, meaningful and effective participation of LGBTI Indigenous peoples in decision-making processes at all levels and in all spheres. Thirdly, we encourage all relevant mechanisms to include broken down data regarding specific challenges and features of LGBTI realities. As such, we think it's necessary to build institutional capacities and within the United Nations to improve data collection and integrate intersectional analysis of this data in line with Agenda 2030 and in line with our collective commitment not to leave anyone behind. Madam Chair, we encourage the Permanent Forum to consider the importance of tackling stigma facing LGBTI Indigenous people. As a core group, we are fully committed to guaranteeing visibility of LGBTI Indigenous peoples. We are committed to putting an end to the stigmatization of these peoples. We continue to appeal to member states and the United Nations to adopt effective measures in this realm. Thank you.
I thank the representative from Chile. I now call upon the representative from the Fund for the Development of the Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Gracias, señor. Thank you, Madam Chair. Excellencies, distinguished members of the Permanent Forum, representatives of states and Indigenous peoples here present. Adopted in 2007, the Declaration is a reference point in terms of normative instruments recognizing, promoting and protecting individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean. The Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, FELAC, has constantly supported national and regional processes guided towards implementing the Declaration. We've strengthened frameworks for dialogue and cooperation between states and Indigenous peoples to this end. As an intergovernmental body that is egalitarian in nature and unique, FELAC brings together in its governance structure both government representatives and Indigenous representatives. Such membership has for more than 3 decades facilitated intercultural dialogue and spaces for building achievements together. We've reaffirmed the importance of mutual respect, effective participation and the notion of joint responsibility. These are all pillars of building more inclusive and sustainable societies. Regarding good practices, we want to underscore the fact that we encourage Indigenous people's participation, including that of Indigenous young people and women, in decision-making processes by building capacities and developing mechanisms which can have a positive impact on Indigenous participation in public policy development. We support initiatives linked to territorial security, and we contribute to the recognition and protection of rights to land, territories and natural resources. All of these are crucial for identity, sustainability and development of Indigenous peoples. The promotion of traditional practices and knowledge in sustainable management of our environments is something we seek to protect, recognizing the invaluable contribution of Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous youth and women, in the conservation of biodiversity and the fight against climate change. To conclude, FELAC reaffirms its commitment to continue working with member states, Indigenous peoples and the UN system with the goal of contributing to the full implementation of the Declaration. We will overcome common challenges and promote inclusive and sustainable solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the representative from FELAC. I now call upon an Indigenous parliamentarian from the Crimean Tatar representing the Indigenous Crimean Tatars of Crimea.
Dear Chairman, brothers and sisters, I express my gratitude to the member states for supporting Ukraine against Russia's war crimes. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a moral and legal commitment by the international community to protect the rights of peoples to identity, self-government, and justice. It is a hope for millions of indigenous people around the world. Russia's military aggression against Ukraine grossly violates the UN Charter and the Declaration. Russia occupied Crimea in 2014, violating Article 137. 151 representatives of the indigenous Crimean Tatar people are in Russian prisons. 2 political prisoners died in prison. This is a violation of Article 1.7. Russia banned Majlis, the representative body of the Crimean Tatars, accusing it of extremism and violating the right of the indigenous people to govern representative institution, Article 5, 18, and 19. Rewrites and falsifies the history of Crimea and the Crimean Tatar people, violating of Article 15. Conducts population replacement in violation of Article 8.9. In its turn, Ukraine is 2021 adopted the law of Ukraine on the rights of indigenous peoples of Ukraine. However, the government of Ukraine doesn't fulfill this law, and for 18 months has not made a decision on the legalization of Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people. Recommendations. I call on Russia to stop the war and withdraw its army from the territory of Ukraine. I call on the US to implement the security guarantees given to Ukraine and to prevent recognition the occupied Crimea as Russian. I call on Ukraine to provide the legal status of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people as a representative body of the indigenous people and to include its representatives in the peace-building negotiation process. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Indigenous parliamentarian, distinguished delegates. We have heard the last speaker on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon in this conference room starting at 3 o'clock. Before we adjourn, and I apologize in advance for the short amount of time that we have, I would like to invite the panelists to share their reflections on the statements that have been made, and I would encourage and ask the panelists to keep their interventions for 1 minute. I now call upon Ms. Kelleher.
I am so honored to hear your statements, and I truly am inspired to know that together we are stronger. And I know that it takes sometimes 7 generations to accomplish our goals. So I thank you for this opportunity moving together, and I encourage you, if you're interested in trying our scorecard, that you speak with us to pilot the study and help to scale it up. Thank you so much. Ana Masif Kuyana.
I thank Ms. Kelleher, and I now call upon Ms. Hallett, please.
Thank you very much. We recognize the progress undertaken by states and UN agencies.
Excuse me. I ask people to be quiet and respect the panelists. Thank you. I apologize for that. You may proceed.
Thank you. We recognize the progress undertaken by states and UN agencies, but urgent action needs to be done to implement the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples are continuously threatened by imposed climate solutions and extractivism, and the continuous denial of us Indigenous peoples with collective rights and our concerns that we are raising at the national level and in this forum is a hindrance to truly achieving the ends of the UN dream. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I now turn to Mr. Kali Said.
I just wanted to say that two challenges that is still in the air to comply with the Declaration of the Right of Indigenous People is the use of capital letters to use capitalization of indigenous peoples in all our documents as indigenous peoples. That is something that indigenous organizations has to have also in their mind. Another thing is that to be conscious that this is the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. The declaration is for indigenous peoples, not for another type of organization of social sectors. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Many thanks indeed to you, Mr. Kalitsai.
Upon Ms. Kiss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to everybody who's made statements to this point. Indigenous peoples are obviously committed to the realisation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but we need states to come to the party to deliver on their agreed and committed obligations, and we need to be working together to do this. So I look forward to engaging with Indigenous peoples and states globally to implement the Declaration.
Thank you for your remarks. I now give the floor over to Mr. Machaca.
The implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is crucial in terms of recognizing collective rights. This is key for the very survival and lives of Indigenous peoples, and here full commitment from Amazonian countries to working to including Indigenous peoples in their work is crucial. The region of the Amazon has 4 primary characteristics. It has its biodiversity, it has its forests, water, and Indigenous peoples. And within the Indigenous peoples, there are isolated Indigenous peoples and those in first contact. That's key. Tomorrow we'll have a side event. We'll hear from the Indigenous peoples in the Amazonian mechanism at 11:30 tomorrow. We'll be in conference room 5. You are invited to that side event. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your summary. We shall continue our consideration of agenda item 3 this afternoon. In this conference room, we shall hear the remaining speakers on the list for the general discussion under this item after an introductory statement on a related study by a forum member. I thank everyone for your participation. This meeting is adjourned.